This screencast is looking at Summer 17 question 1, particularly focused on part F and part G on transfer pricing. So hopefully you've read through the question, even attempted the requirements. One thing you'll note as you read through the case studies in SFMA is the examiner will use headings in terms of paragraphs to map to sections of requirements. So for example, the proposed IPO and offer paragraphs here under the heading will map to A, B and C, which are all related to the proposed IPO and the offer. Then D and F are to do with divisional performance, and then divisional managerial performance has a subheading, and the one we're looking at, then transfer pricing, has its own paragraph and its own two sections or requirements, F and G. So again, it's just useful, and the more practice you get that, particularly in a mock setting or something like that, gives you more efficiency in terms of how you decide which questions you want to start with. You don't always have to start with part A. If other parts come naturally, for example, we could start here with part F because they're not dependent on any previous requirements. So we're looking at part F, which asks us, for each of the following scenarios, calculate the range of acceptable negotiated transfer prices for this BLG 456 and briefly explain the impact on your answer. And you're given 3 different scenarios about capacity, and that's 8 marks, so you're about 16 minutes there. Then a small little add-on as a narrative, outlining explain 2 reasons why the proposed intervention by Jim and Paul in the setting of transfer pricing may not be in the firm's best interest. So 12 marks overall, about 24 minutes to do it in the exam setting. Right, and what you'll notice is this question was a carbon copy of Autumn 13 question 2. So go back and look at that in your own time. Autumn 13 question 2, part C, was PERC limited. And we'll see the examiner feedback at the end. Some students really had practiced the past questions and were duly rewarded last summer, in Summer 17. So the background to this, we'll just look at it briefly. It's an agri company focused on agricultural feed, and they're looking at expanding into the fertilizer industry. Now they're obviously looking at an IPO and the performance measurement, but we're going to park those because we're not really interested in them. For this section, we're interested in the transfer pricing paragraph. So you have 2 divisions, and again, the first part always of a transfer pricing question is understand what's going on. So in this case, we have alpha and beta, and alpha can sell to beta or it can sell externally. So it's 2 choices. So if we look at there, if we just write it down, alpha can sell externally or it can sell to beta. So it's the manufacturer, just so we know what's going on, and it's based on negotiations, but they've so far proven unsuccessful. And Paul and Jim, who are the head office people, in terms of the directors, they're getting a bit annoyed at the situation and they want to personally intervene if they can't negotiate themselves. So we know negotiation is one particular one, but there are others. So that's the background, and we're given information then in Schedule 2, which hopefully I have it here, about the price that they can charge externally, the quantities involved, and we're told here a number of other bits of information that will help influence us. So they're all sold in batches. Alpha must sell to beta if beta orders with them, so they've no choice if beta wants to get it. And likewise, just to make sure we can't split up the orders, beta must buy from one supplier. So you can't do a partial order. You're either going to fulfill the full 2800 batches or you're going to fulfill none, just due to quality control. And beta has the availability of an external product. So they can buy it from a third party or an external company at 900. So that's what we call setting the roof, or that sets the ceiling on negotiation. And beta then has the ability to sell externally if it doesn't sell internally. So the key thing that we're asked in this question, and what it looks at in negotiation, is, does it make sense to go into negotiations? So does it make sense here depending on different scenarios? So remember, when you're looking at negotiated transfer pricing, you're looking for a range of acceptable prices. That's what we're looking for. So for the seller, what we're looking for is the theoretical minimum. And for the buyer, which in this case the seller is alpha, the buyer is beta, we're looking for the theoretical maximum. And if you'd looked at the Autumn 13, if students did this in Summer 17, they would have got nearly full marks, a lot of them, as we'll see in the examiner feedback. So what we're trying to say is it only makes sense to negotiate a transfer price, or negotiation will only work if what the minimum the seller wants to sell at, right, is lower than what the buyer is willing to pay. because otherwise you won't have a range where they can negotiate and you'll come to a viable answer. So we have three scenarios then. Scenario 1, and these are different types of capacity issues, because we know from your lectures, from your study, capacity in the seller has a big implication of what the minimum transfer price is. In scenario 1, Alpha has budgeted to sell 2,000 batches externally. So that means they have full capacity. If we go back to the question, they have full capacity of 5,000, meaning they have spare capacity of 3,000 batches. So that's what that's telling us, that we have spare capacity of 3,000 batches. So in that instance, we have spare capacity. We are never going to use this. Alpha is never going to use it otherwise. So the transfer price, the minimum transfer price, should be set at either what we call variable cost or marginal cost. So in this case, the transfer price is going to be set at 450 plus 180 plus 210. So 840. So the minimum price for Alpha is 840. And what that is, why is it the minimum? Because it's the price they'd be no worse off at. They were never going to use this capacity anyway, the 3,000 batches. So if they have to use it, they will incur 840 per batch. So if they got 840 back, they'd be no worse off. It's not to say they'd accept that, but that's the theoretical minimum for the negotiation. That is the floor in the range. Now the theoretical maximum that the buyer would be willing to pay will always be 900. 900 is the transfer price max. There would be no reason for Beta to pay more than 900 because that's where they can buy it elsewhere. And if you look at each division separately, why would we pay more than 900 to Alpha when I can buy it elsewhere at 900? So in this case, there is an acceptable range to internegotiations. It does make financial sense. So we can see here, if any transfer price was agreed between 840 and 900, it makes sense for both parties. So for example, we'll just say the transfer price was set at 880. Just for example, it can be any of them. If it was set at 880, well, Alpha are now going to make €40 contribution because it cost them 840 to make it, variable cost, and they're getting 880. So they're now getting €40 extra a batch that they would have never used anyway because it was spare capacity, because they could only sell 2,000 externally. Likewise, Beta can now buy €20 a batch cheaper than they would have externally. So they're better off as well. So it's a win-win. So in this instance, there is an acceptable range between the floor and the ceiling. Therefore, they should negotiate and they should be able to agree. So let's look at the next scenario. Right. Now, the next scenario I'm going to look at is scenario 3. Right, we're skipping scenario 2 because that's a bit trickier, and we'll come back to that. In this case, there's no spare capacity. Alpha currently produce and sell 5,000 batches externally, so they have no spare capacity. They're currently operating at full tilt. So any sales made internally to Beta will result in external sales forgone. So what does that mean? It means if they have to sell to Beta internally, they're going to lose external sales. And when you lose external sales, you have an opportunity cost. And that is the lost contribution. So remember, external sales, we're told in the question, every external sale you're selling at 1,200. So the contribution, the CPU, is 1,200 minus 840, which is the variable cost of its batch. So every sale that Alpha loses because it has to make to Beta instead of externally, they're losing 360. So the theoretical price now, the minimum, will not only be variable cost, but also opportunity cost. So in this case, it'll be 840 plus 360, which is the 1,200. And that should hopefully make sense to people as well, intuitively. What we're saying is we want the price that the seller would be no worse off with. If they can sell at 1,200 externally, well then they want to be selling at 1,200 internally to be no worse off. However, the transfer price, the max the buyer is willing to pay, is still 900. So in this case, it doesn't make financial sense. There is no range of acceptable prices. They shouldn't negotiate. Let alpha sell externally, let beta buy externally. That'll make them better off. There's no acceptable price that'll be better off for both of them. And that's all you have to conclude. Very similar to Autumn 13 in its structure. Now, scenario 2 is tricky, and why I left it at the end is it's a combination of the previous two. So in scenario 2, you will have 3,000 batches sold externally. So you have 2,000 units spare capacity, but you haven't enough. Because remember, you have only 2,000 units you're not using because your max capacity is 5,000. But to fulfill beta's order, which you're told in this bullet point has to be a full order from a single supplier, you need 800 units, or 800 we'll call it batches, need to be taken from external sales. So in this case, we have 2,000 batches, which is similar to, in this case, scenario 1, where you have spare capacity. However, 800 batches is similar to scenario 3 in that you have no spare capacity. So that was a tricky one, that you had to combine your knowledge of scenario 1 and scenario 3. And in this case, what you're looking at is, you're saying, well, the theoretical minimum price now is two different ones. And this is tricky. It's 2,000 units at 840, and it's 800 units at 1,200. Because the 2,000 units we would have never used anyway, it was spare capacity. So the minimum price there, to be no worse off, is variable cost. However, the other 800 we are eating into our sales to external customers, and therefore we want to get the full 1,200 we would have gotten from those customers. Now, unfortunately, we cannot compare that to the theoretical price, the maximum of 900. So we can't really compare like for like there. So what the good student had to realize was you need to get the weighted average cost. What is the weighted average cost for the full 2,800 units? So how you do that is you get the total cost, 2,000 times 840 plus 800 times 1,200, and you divide by the number of units, which is 2,800. That will give us, over the whole order, what's the average price per batch that alpha wants. And what you should hopefully have come up with is 943. 943 euro, which in this case means it doesn't make financial sense to enter into negotiation, because the minimum that alpha wants is higher than the maximum beta will pay, so they'll never do a deal. And the only thing that's going to happen there is it's going to lead to conflict, and it's going to waste time. Right, so that's one particular type of computational transfer pricing requirement where you're given little scenarios. You need to understand variable cost, you need to understand opportunity cost, you need to understand capacity. And where this is coming from, if you look at your slides, one of these, this is the slide in session 5. In order to maximize group profit, the following rules apply. No capacity constraints, meaning you have spare capacity. Transfer price is at marginal cost, which is same term as variable cost. But if there are capacity constraints, meaning there is no spare capacity or only some, transfer price is set at variable cost plus opportunity cost. And the very last point is the important one for scenario 2. Remember, this is what you'd have in your notes. It says in the situation where there will be two transfer prices, you can have the first one up to the level where there is no capacity constraint, in our case 2,000 units. The next one from where the capacity constraint starts, i.e. for the next 800. That is coming from session 5 in your notes. And again, if you want to practice another question in that regard, look at Autumn 13 question 2, a question called Perk Limited. Now the last little add-on was for 4 marks. Outline and explain 2 reasons why the proposed intervention by Jim and Paul may not be in the firm's best interest. Well, this should hopefully be fairly intuitive from the question. Your logic is, if these are 2 divisions, if you dictate the price from head office, you're going to demotivate people. It's going to be demotivating, number 1, and it also may be unfair. We're not really told in the question what type of responsibility centre they are, but if these alpha and beta are 2 profit centres, i.e. they're accountable for the profits they earn, it's unfair to then dictate what they should buy and sell at, yet you're measuring their performance on their outcome of that buying and selling. So it's somewhat of a contradiction. Right? So it can lead to conflict. It can result in demotivation. You're going to demotivate your managers if they know it's unfair that they have to buy and sell at a certain price, even though they know they can buy and sell externally at a different price. So it's not going to be in the firm's best interest, and if anything, it's going to result in conflict, and it's going to reduce the overall value of the business. Right, so there's 2 or 3 other ones in the suggested solution, but you're looking for 4 marks, 2 marks each for 2 points. Right. Just want to show you very briefly the examiner feedback that year. In terms of the transfer pricing requirement, candidates either scored very high or very low marks, and that was very much closely related to if you practiced transfer pricing past exam questions, particularly Autumn 13 question 2, you would have nearly got full marks very quickly. Right. In terms of the narrative, many candidates did reasonably well in the section, provided 1 or 2 valid answers. Right. Candidates who did not score well here did so because they only provided 1 valid reason or did not develop the points. So that's important, is you're asked for 2, you can only get full marks if you give 2, and likewise it says outline and explain. So when you're looking through the question, always watch for the verbs used. It's not just a quick bullet point. If you want to get the 2 marks, you need to explain it as well. So that means more than a short, brief sentence. So that screencast looked at Summer 17 question 1, part F and G on transfer pricing.